Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and today is episode 1 of my series, The Mexican Revolution, the Porfiriato. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. Mexico became independent from Spain in 1821, but it then experienced a constant turnover of governments. Throughout the next several decades, there was one constant, a clash between conservatives and liberal reformers. The conservatives wanted a single ruler who relied on the support of the Catholic Church, large landowners, and the military. The reformers wanted a federal state, a weaker church, more personal liberty, and a more equitable share of the land. I explain this in greater detail in my podcast on the French intervention in Mexico, but the clash between conservatives and liberals flared into a war when a liberal government greatly weakened the power of the Catholic Church, and the clergy persuaded several conservative generals to revolt in 1858. The War of Reform between liberals and conservatives ended in a liberal victory in 1860, but both sides had run up sizable debts to foreign creditors. Using those debts as an excuse, Emperor Louis Napoleon III of France placed Archduke Maximilian, the younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, on the throne of Mexico. Although armies loyal to the Republican government of President Benito Juarez were defeated by a French army in 1864, Maximilian never gained the support of the Mexican populace, just the conservative elite, while the countryside was dominated by Juaristas, guerrillas loyal to Juarez. After the fall of the Confederacy in 1865, American pressure, combined with the threat of war with Prussia, caused Louis Napoleon to withdraw the French army in 1867, and Maximilian was overthrown less than 2 months later. Although he was one of the leading Juarista generals during the French intervention, Porfiro Diaz became the leader of a faction opposed to Juarez. The two men had different philosophies, since Juarez presented himself as the civilian leader of an elected government, while Diaz was a general who emphasized military strength and internal order. When Juarez defeated him in the 1871 election, Diaz led a rebellion claiming that Juarez's repeated re-elections were against the Constitution. Following Juarez's death in 1872, Diaz accepted an amnesty but revolted again when Juarez's successor, Sebastián Lerdo, announced that he would seek re-election in 1876. This revolt would have likely failed again, like all the others, but Diaz had excellent timing because Lerdo had canceled railroad concessions granted to some of the wealthiest men in the U.S. The Mexican government wanted a rail system that linked various regions of the nation, while the Americans wanted a north-south line from El Paso to Mexico City. Lerdo then rejected a trade pact between the U.S. and Mexico, infuriating American financiers who resented Lerdo's desire to avoid economic dependence on the U.S. As a hacendado, the owner of a hacienda, basically a large estate, Diaz was an eager convert to the goal of modernizing Mexico to improve trade for his fellow hacendados. Financial support from wealthy Americans like Richard King and James Stillman ensured that Diaz received a steady supply of weapons. Lacking Diaz's access to capital, Lerdo found it difficult to supply an army, while Diaz allied with leading provincial families like the Trevinos of Nuevo León and the Maderos of Coahuila, which enabled him to drive Lerdo into exile in 1876. Although he won election as president in 1877, Diaz's position was far from secure, so he emphasized negotiation, rewarding followers with patronage. Elections were held regularly, but only candidates who had Diaz's approval won at the national and the state levels. Even then, the state governors ruled with a great deal of autonomy as long as they did not directly oppose his government. After choosing a trustworthy candidate to replace him in 1880, Diaz ran again in 1884. Returning to power, Diaz strengthened his grip on the nation through relationships with local strongmen, the ley fuga, basically political assassinations where prisoners were executed and later described as attempting to escape, and peonage, where peasants were transformed into serfs by binding them to haciendas. Unwilling to waste time with the charade of alternating presidential terms with a trustworthy candidate, Diaz simply amended the Constitution to permit the re-election of the president and governors. Believing that Mexico's economy required severe reform, Diaz appointed José Yves Limantour, Minister of Finance in 1893. Limantour balanced the budget, improved Mexico's credit, and strengthened banking relations, which encouraged foreign corporations and financiers to invest in Mexico, especially in Mexican railways. Although Diaz's position was secure, his closest advisors were divided into two factions. One faction was the Científicos, led by Finance Minister Limantour. Technocrats, they believed in scientific politics, where social order and economic progress were more important than individual liberty and popular elections. Their main rival was a faction led by former General Bernardo Reyes, who was pro-business and a traditional conservative, but willing to introduce mild reforms. While Diaz would repeatedly announce that he was tired and wanted to retire, he would not react well if a faction leader actually attempted to position himself as a successor. When Finance Minister Limantour proposed to run in the 1900 election, Diaz pointed out that the Constitution required that both of a candidate's parents be Mexican, but his father was French. Since Bernardo Reyes, the leader of the anti-Científicos faction, was positioning himself as a candidate, Limantour had no choice but to back Diaz, who reluctantly ran again. In 1903, Diaz changed the laws to permit another re-election in 1904 and lengthened the term to 6 years. Diaz controlled all levels of the government, either directly appointing the position or ensuring that there was only one name on the ballot. Loyalists were granted monopolies, while bonds for state or municipal projects required approval by the Treasury Minister, who would recommend a specific bank to handle the bond, and the bankers would insist that a firm controlled by them did the work, ensuring that everyone benefited. Well, except for the municipal or the state government, which had to pay more for substandard work. The Porfiriato was essentially the victory of the conservatives over the reformers, but Diaz succeeded because he co-opted both liberals and conservatives. Liberals saw economic progress, while conservatives saw the church regain much of its former prestige and wealth, but it did not become dominant, which would have sparked an anti-clerical movement. Most important, the massive expansion of the bureaucracy offered employment for educated people. That was the carrot. The stick was ruthless, efficient repression of any opposition. Press freedom was steadily destroyed as the government jailed editors of papers that reported on the corruption or the beneficial terms granted to foreign companies. Speaking of foreign companies, American financial support of Diaz's revolt paid off when he permitted large-scale American construction of railroads in Mexico. 40 rail concessions were granted by Diaz between 1877 and 1884, but almost all went to foreigners. American investment flooded over the border, led by James Stillman, chairman of National City Bank, John D. Rockefeller's brother William, and Jay Gould. The bonds to pay for the railroads were organized by an alliance between Stillman, J.P. Morgan, and powerful financier George Baker. The three men then cooperated with William Rockefeller and E.H. Harriman to take control of the Mexican National Railroad. Morgan then arranged for Cyrus McCormick's International Harvester to acquire Deering Harvester in 1902 in exchange for McCormick allowing Morgan, Rockefeller, Stillman, and Harriman to buy shares in the Henneken market in Yucatan, which was controlled by McCormick. Henneken was used to produce hemp, and the Henneken plantations in the Yucatan were hellholes with death rates for laborers equivalent to sugar plantations in the Caribbean a century earlier. While the resulting network was impressive, it was predominantly north-south in order to build an export market to the U.S. Once the railroads were built, American investors funded mines and oil fields. Huge capital was required to make them profitable, and only the American consortiums had the necessary capital. A key event that drove American investment was the McKinley Tariff Act of 1890, which put a tariff on imported silver. The Guggenheim family had previously imported silver from Mexico, but responded by expanding into Mexico to mine and refine silver there. Diaz had never granted such a concession before, but he wanted Mexico's economy to expand, so he allowed the Guggenheims to build their smelter at Monterrey. The smelter paid good wages, but the locals were unaccustomed to long work hours and could earn enough to live by only working for periods of time. So a private militia was required to keep the locals digging in the mines. While the Guggenheim family controlled most of the silver mines and smelters in Mexico, they left the copper industry to mining corporations controlled by financiers like Rockefeller and Stillman. In 1899, the big four of the American railroad industry, Stillman, Rockefeller, Harriman, and Gould, formed the Amalgamated Copper Company to dominate global copper production. The situation illustrates the key problem for the Mexican government, namely that the American financiers did not compete against each other. By 1910, Americans owned 17 of the 31 largest mining companies, and 10 of the remaining 14 had British owners. The Madero family of Coahuila was the only Mexican owners of a vertically integrated mine-to-smelter complex. The oil market had exploded around the turn of the century following the switch from coal to oil for ships and the invention of cars. American oil tycoon Edward Doheny began drilling for oil near Tampico in 1901. Diaz was eager for foreign investment to stimulate the development of Mexico's natural resources, but he distrusted Standard Oil. So he only made an agreement with Doheny after confirming that John D. Rockefeller was not involved. Around the same time, Limantour and Diaz granted a massive oil concession in Veracruz to Sir Wheatman Pearson, a British engineer who had already completed several large-scale engineering projects in Mexico. Both Doheny and Pearson soon found huge oil deposits, transforming Mexico into an oil exporter. The oil boom caused the population in Tampico to explode. Jobs were plentiful but low-paying with little chance of promotion. The concentration in the mining industry was echoed in the agricultural industry. The government permitted the seizure of land from small landholders by claiming that the title was not legal, or it was communal land, or it was owned by the municipality. Land that had been farmed by families for generations was sold to rich, connected men for cheap prices. An unintended side effect of the massive acquisition of village communal land by hacendados was the switch in crops, since more profitable cash crops like rubber, coffee, henequen, and sugar replaced food crops like corn and wheat, thus increasing the price of staple foods for the peasants. As haciendas switched to more profitable cash crops intended for export, Mexico became more dependent on imported food, which led to higher prices that the poor could not afford. By the end of the 1890s, the peasant share of the land had shrunk from 25% to 2%. Formerly independent farmers were treated like serfs, and productivity fell. Many of the same American financiers who had bankrolled the railroads and the mines purchased massive tracts of land. George Hearst had been an early investor, but his son William Randolph Hearst bought huge tracts of land. He was not alone, and there were hundreds of American owners of large haciendas and 15,000 smaller farmers and ranchers by 1910. Nearly 27% of Mexican land was owned by Americans by 1910, and other foreigners owned 8%. In fact, the northern states attracted growing numbers of American immigrants who expected that these states would be annexed by the U.S. sooner or later, preferably sooner. With roughly 3,000 American immigrants entering each year, the number of Americans in Mexico had reached almost 40,000 by 1910. Since they generally lived in colonies, they did not assimilate to the local culture, but remained Americans living in Mexico. Aside from the end of independent farms during the Porfiriato, the nature of urban labor had changed as skilled artisans were replaced by laborers in factories. Paid less than artisans, they formed labor groups which became unions. The key issue is that while the economy grew, the middle class remained small, so there was no sense that life was getting better, despite the hard work of the laborers in mines and haciendas. Since American firms preferred to hire Americans as mechanics or brakemen on their railroads or foremen in mines and factories, Mexicans had few opportunities to move up the economic ladder, which fueled strikes. Industrial production was concentrated in Mexico City and Monterrey, but production was growing in the cities of Orizaba, Puebla, and Veracruz. As the wages of Mexican laborers could not keep up with rising prices, tensions rose. Workers in French-owned textile mills in Orizaba formed a union in 1905, demanding a 5% increase in wages and an end to payment in scrip redeemable only in company stores. The French managers refused, so the union went on strike. Siding with the French mill owners, Diaz sent troops to Rio Blanco's textile mill complex where they killed between 50 and 70 workers. The repression simply sparked more strikes across the nation during the next couple of years. The most famous strike occurred in Sonora, where the government had encouraged massive American and British investment to build railroads and copper mines and smelters. In June 1906, miners protested for a pay increase, the end of a dual salary system, an 8-hour day, and Mexican foremen. Colonel Green, the owner, refused to negotiate. Confrontations between armed guards and angry mobs of workers escalated until the guards fired into the crowds, killing at least 50 people on June 6. Federal troops were on their way, but Green turned to a closer source of reinforcements, namely 200 to 300 Arizona Rangers who were deputized by the governor on June 7th. Combined with recently arrived federal troops, resistance was futile. General Torres gave the miners a simple choice: return to work or be forced into the army. The strike had been broken, but it had an unintended side effect. The blatant use of foreign troops to crush a strike by Mexicans gave Limantour an excuse to begin the nationalization of American-owned railroads and mines to resist growing American dominance of the economy. But the nationalization moved slowly and was delayed by lawyers and lobbyists. When Mexico celebrated the 100-year anniversary of independence from Spain on September 15, 1910, 80-year-old President Diaz had ruled Mexico for the past 34 years. Therefore, the celebration was suitably lavish. On the surface, Mexico was prosperous, since the government had produced a balanced budget since 1894 and had large cash reserves. However, the vast majority of Mexicans did not share that prosperity. 1 out of every 2 children died in their first year, and 84% of the population was illiterate. A generation had grown up in stability and was grateful, but Diaz's refusal to help workers eroded his popularity. Like many elderly people, Diaz disliked change. So the same group of governors and legislators were reelected along with him. Convinced that native Mexicans were simply incapable of building a modern Mexico, Diaz turned a blind eye to the monopolistic practices of the foreign companies. There were few calls for a revolution, but Diaz's position was less secure by 1910. I will explain the unexpected threat to Diaz's rule next episode. Thanks for listening.